Welcome to this class, and in a lot of ways, this is the end of an era for us. An era, an error. Was it a mistake? Maybe so. Um, anyway, we are kind of finish up the last 20 years of American history, particularly political history, just to kind of have some basics of kind of the landscape of our nation politically, and just so you can be an informed human being and citizen of this country, and future voter. Um, so, uh, we ended talking about the Clinton presidency in the last video. And one thing that I think you're going to see happening is there's this kind of pendulum swing going on. You had Reagan as a backlash to Carter, right? So you had Carter, liberal Democrat, then Reagan. Bush followed Reagan because of Reagan's popularity, the first Bush, but then you have Democrat in Clinton, and then now you have Republican. I want you to know that George W. Bush was a Republican. And then after George W. Bush, you have Obama, Democrat, and then Trump, Republican. So you've kind of seen this back and forth. It doesn't mean every single election is a back and forth because some presidents serve 2 years, some or two terms, some just one. But there is a sort of back and forth in American politics where people will vote one way and then they'll vote another, or at least, maybe not the same people changing their votes, although that does happen. But for some, for other reasons, maybe more people vote in a certain election or whatnot. Um, so one thing to clarify is, and this is a question that a lot of you guys got wrong, and I think you got it wrong because it was on the Edpuzzle thing. I think you got it wrong because you weren't paying attention. So sorry, but I asked why George H.W. Bush led us into Iraq after we talked about that, and a lot of you guys answered with things about 9/11, and that's not the case at all. George H.W., the father of George W. Bush, who was president in the early 90s, led America into war against Iraq. Same opponent and same name. I know that's confusing, right? We're in Iraq two different times, and both presidents are named Bush, but two different presidents. But the reason George H.W. Bush led the country to fight against Iraq in the 1990s, in 91, I believe it was because Iraq invaded Kuwait. And Kuwait was a partner with us, traded oil to us, and we were trying to get rid of, Iraq out of Kuwait. Okay, so that was the reason. It was not a war on terror. It was not to remove Saddam Hussein. We did not remove Saddam Hussein. We just got him out of Kuwait. Okay, so we had very different objectives when we went into Iraq and fought against Iraq the first time. Our objective was to get them out of Kuwait. After that, we pretty much ended the whole thing. Okay, and possibly it was something that we regretted. Maybe we should have gotten rid of Saddam Hussein when we could because he was a terrible dude, but we didn't do it. 2001 comes around. George W. Bush is recently elected president. The election of 2000 was very controversial. It really came down, this is kind of one of these things that, where people can point out and say, every vote really does matter, especially if you're in a swing state like Florida. But Florida votes were very disputed because the paper ballots, these little papers had these little holes that were like perforated called chads. And there were some of those that, you pressed the hole and that was to vote for, whoever, Bush or Gore. Al Gore was the one who ran against Bush. And some of those were like not all the way through. So the Chad was hanging. It wasn't like detached, and it had to be totally detached. So how did they count those? There was just a lot of controversy on how to count these things because the reality was it wasn't like in Florida that Bush won in a landslide. He won by a few votes in a few districts, and some of those were hard to figure out. So it was a confusing time, and there was, after the election, there was a long time where people were trying to figure out, is this legitimate? Is Gore going, Gore going to sue about this? And there was just a lot of controversy surrounding the 2000 election. George Bush was a conservative. He came on the scene as a conservative Republican. And I'll just say for myself, I liked George Bush. I thought, his domestic policy was clear. He wanted low taxes. He wanted the government to be responsible when it came to its spending. He wanted to reform immigration in a way that made sense, that wasn't anti-immigrant, but also, our laws would be consistent and make sense. There's a lot of things that Bush proposed that were domestic policies that were very conservative and made sense to conservatives, and he won the election. And then, you know what I mean by domestic. Domestic means at home. And then 9/11 happens, and basically his entire presidency was spent on trying to figure out how to defeat terrorism and how to avoid 9/11 from happening again. And so, I don't countenance anyone who, talks about 9/11 as conspiracy theory and that Bush did 9/11. I think that's ridiculous. It was a crazy event to live through. The only, living through the coronavirus, which isn't as nearly as scary, but it has us all, impacts our life even more. This is about the only thing that I in my life can compare 9/11 to, because 9/11 was such a huge thing to feel that your country is under attack, to feel like you might go to war, that you might be drafted. This is World War III. I was 20 years old at the time, or almost 20. I was 19, about to turn 20. And it was just really, that's a lot to process and what this might mean. And Americans responded with just huge amounts of patriotism. Before, I would definitely write down, we did go to war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan. We did pass the Patriot Act, which gave the government a lot more kind of ability to kind of spy on people, and people see it as infringement on their freedoms. So clearly, the result of 9/11 was the government grew in a way. It grew in its ability to find out things about people and its influence on people's lives, and it grew in the sense of military abroad and our influence overseas. Which isn't a very conservative thing to have the government grow. So, there's a little bit of a contradiction there. But what I don't have written on there in the notes, and I think I'd want you to know, is 9/11 was, it took an event like that. We were a pretty divided country after the election of 2000. And 9/11 really changed the character of our country, at least temporarily. People began to love their country and realize how important and how special it was. And you saw it in a way that I don't think you'd seen it for a long time. People begin to go to church and take religious, spiritual matters seriously, because this was a serious thing, and people were scared, and people were looking for answers. That's one of the huge effects of 9/11 that we don't really think about. I don't think those things lasted, unfortunately, because people are fickle, and people, do turn to important things in a time of crisis, but then they oftentimes forget them when things get back to normal. So, from a political perspective, 9/11 changed us by, we went to war against Al Qaeda, the terrorist group responsible for it, to hunt down Osama bin Laden, which we eventually did. We went to war against terror. We weren't sure if, we went to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan was clearly harboring members of Al Qaeda. The Iraq connection was much less clear. We were, our government told us there were weapons of mass destruction. Not sure if that was the case. It's pretty clear that there were not the kind of weapons that they were thinking they had. But it was also clear that Iraq was under the control of a terrible dictator, and I think that was really the realities Bush wanted to address that situation. Let's see here. President Barack Obama. again, I'm going over this broadly. Barack Obama represents a sharp move to the left after Bush's decline in popularity. So after Bush had a huge surge in popularity immediately after 9/11, people were super patriotic and they loved Bush as president. But by the end of the Bush administration, I would also note the economy was in decline. There was a huge recession because of housing crisis. And Bush just had not been popular. The war in Iraq and Afghanistan was not popular. And so Bush was clearly not very popular. And so the election of Barack Obama was kind of a referendum on two things. One, Bush. Did you like Bush or not? And a lot of people didn't like Bush, even though he'd already served his 2 terms. He wasn't running again, but in a way he was, because what he stood for was what the Republicans stood for. So it was a referendum on Bush, which he lost. Secondly, it was a referendum on race because, as you know, Barack Obama was the first black president, and that excited a lot of people, the fact that there was a possibility of a legitimate possibility of an African American being able to be president. Obama's campaign was intentionally vague. He talked about hope and change. He talked about the future. He just, he didn't really talk a lot about policy. He talked about how things were going to be better in the future, and there's going to be hope and change. And the one thing that he did talk about was, affordable. 2 F's in affordable. He talked about the trying to bring healthcare to all, and eventually that's what Congress passed. And we're still kind of figuring out what this means, honestly. The Affordable Health Care Act, is a way to try to expand healthcare to all, but it does it in some odd ways. It's not government takeover of healthcare industry, which is kind of a straightforward thing to do. It is a way to kind of bridge private healthcare industry and public funding and kind of put these two together. So it does things like force people to buy medical insurance through a private company. If they couldn't afford that, then they could get it through the website, which had a lot of issues and problems. I remember, when I moved back to the United States, I was a single dad with 3 kids, and I didn't make a lot of money, and so I think I qualified for the Obamacare, insurance, and so I applied for it, and it took them about 8 months to get back to me, and by then I had a different job, and I was I was married, and it's like I didn't really need it anymore, and my kids were covered under a different health insurance policy. But anyway, that was my experience with Obamacare. And then I couldn't get them off of the Obamacare system, even though they had their own, and that took forever. So anyway, it was kind of a mess. That's you clearly can't just say that's all Obama's fault, but the government-run healthcare kind of thing, it did certainly help some people with healthcare. It also there's a lot of complexities to the situation, and really there's the question of, does the U.S. government have the ability and the power? Can they say you have to buy health insurance? That's certainly a kind of broad role of government in society and a power given to government. That's a really legitimate question. And eventually it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said they could because the penalty was a tax. But anyway, so I think, when it's all said and done, the Affordable Health Care Act, Obamacare, will be sort of what Obama's remembered for largely, and whether or not that succeeds. Trump, in the Trump administration, has kind of cut some of the parts of it down, and so it's kind of soon to tell with that sort of thing. The last thing is a Supreme Court case. And this is not Obama that did it. He is not the Supreme, he's not on the Supreme Court. He did appoint Supreme Court justices, but it is the Obergefell versus Hodges case. And this is the case that you may know was a case concerning gay marriage, and it basically legalized gay marriage all across the country. The White House celebrated this case. And that's why I have it connected to Barack Obama, because they literally, lit the White House up with rainbow colors. And it was clear that Obama and the Democrats and the liberals of our country celebrated gay marriage and celebrated an entirely different view of family that has been accepted in our country up until this point. And this is what some people call a moral revolution. This is a part of that, to where our country's morals and societies, you think back to the 60s and massive changes, we're going through this now. I heard one person say it this way, when this happened, the U.S. government basically legalized gay marriage. It was something. Gay marriage was something that was newer than the cell phone, right? Cell phones had been around longer than this, but now it is the law of the land across the country, and these are massive changes to something that had never been accepted in all of human society is now being celebrated across the country. Our country is in the midst of a moral revolution. And at the same time, as conservatives point out, Obama was very liberal when it came to abortion. And so it's a moral revolution that goes, some different ways. It celebrates, one lifestyle, and it also, there's clearly a lack of respect for unborn human life. So I know these topics are controversial, but it's these topics like gay marriage and like abortion that really fuel the opposition to the liberal democratic forces in our country. And it's those kinds of topics. It's not only those, but it's those in part that help lead to the election of our current president, Donald Trump. Another part of his election, and this is all kind of current events. Elected in, by the way, his election was in 2016. Took over in 2017. Didn't write that on there, but another part of it is that he was seen as someone who could really put our country's economic interests first. A lot of struggling kind of middle America when it came to things like factory workers and people like that that relied on that kind of income was very much struggling. And Trump, with his kind of rhetoric to say we are going to buy American and we're going to support American industry and those kinds of things, really garnered a lot of support from those groups. Even sometimes labor unions that had always been Democrat supported Trump's nomination and his election to the presidency. He has at least styled himself as being sorry, I paused the video there because someone must have taken a hot shower and steam came up and set the fire alarm off. So all is well in the Lytle household. Anyway, we're gonna move on. You guys, if you want to know more about Donald Trump, read the news. Go back and forth between CNN and Fox News, and you'll find radically different stories about our president. That's always fun to do. It's like they're talking about two totally different things, which they are. I think it's important to know that Trump, there was the House of Representatives did formally impeach Trump, and he was not removed from office. And it just points to this kind of huge partisan division. The grounds for impeachment were obstruction of justice. Had to do with him using his influence overseas to investigate Joe Biden and for his own political purposes. And so, but regardless of why he was impeached and that whole thing, it was very clear. The big takeaway with all of this is that his impeachment was universally supported by Democrats and universally rejected by Republicans. And our country is clearly divided when it comes to politics. And, it's not, this is not a new thing, but it is a thing that is I think really significant, because even now with coronavirus, there's a lot of just really stark kind of partisan division when it comes to this. And that's a scary place to be. There's other things going on with, people do not trust the news media. The news media, by and large, has been is seen by conservatives as a tool for the Democrats and the left, and honestly, there's some truth to that, and so, but there's a huge lack of trust in that, and we're kind of in the midst of all of this. I'm trying to keep my head about about me and all this, and remain kind of clear minded. But the fact is, it's hard to know who to trust and what to trust in the information age we live in, with just this flood of information that the internet provides, and we're not really sure what to do with it all. Internet, phones, social media, all that kind of stuff. I put COVID-19 here, and I put question marks because, who knows what historians are going to say about this. But I think it's clear that the moment that we're living in, that what we're doing right now, me giving a class online to you guys, this will be in history books. Not me personally, but I hope not. But teachers having to teach online and students having to learn online because of this, the economic shutdown, the country shutdown. These kinds of things, we don't know what it's going to mean for our country, really, but I do know this is a major event in the country's history. And I think when you study history, when your children are in American history class, Lord willing, they will be in school. There'll still be schools. There'll still be America, unless Christ returns, and then it'll be better. It'll be a lot better than America when Christ reigns. But if there's still American history classes out there and American history teachers in 20 years, whenever you have children, let's say 30 years, why don't you wait? I don't know. That's kind of when they're in high school, though, yeah. 20, 30 years when your kids are in high school. I hope that, or not I hope, I think that the coronavirus will be in the textbooks. I think, something's going to be said about them, and we don't really know what, though. So we're definitely living in a historic moment. That's kind of my point on that. And that brings us up to the present. Now, obviously, there's a lot I left out. And I talked mostly about political history. I think something that I probably should have done and just didn't is talk about the impact of technology. Because if you really look at the world in the last 20 years, probably the biggest change is technology, and how that has impacted our lives and our brains and everything. But that's a lot to get into. But, from internet being something able to access in your house, which kind of started in the mid-90s, to today, that's, man, we're talking about 25 years of time that has just changed the world in just dramatic ways. And we're still figuring out what that means. What is that going to mean for an economy? What's that going to mean for our lives? How does that change who we are and how we interact with each other? There's just so many unknown questions, and so many questions that are worth exploring, the impact of technology in our lives. But this is all I have for you, and this is my last video of this kind of video that I'm doing during this time. Just real briefly, make sure you do your work on your final project. I've posted kind of your schedule and what you need to do. So make sure you do that thing. Enjoy it. Watch the movie and enjoy the movie. Talk about the movie. Read reviews, which I've asked you to do. But I'm asking you to watch a movie, and I will give you the exact questions on the time of the final. But be prepared to talk intelligently about it and to write intelligently. And that's really what I'm asking for. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope you can kind of dig into something in American history, recent American history that strikes your interest, and so you can kind of enjoy studying history these last couple weeks that you have online school. God bless.